There is one single mechanism that holds American global power together. One foundation underneath everything. The military, the economy, the political influence, all of it rests on this one thing. And that thing is called dollar dominance. Most people have never really thought about what that means or how it works. And that is not an accident, because the moment you understand the architecture of how the dollar creates American power, you also start seeing how it creates American vulnerability. And right now, those vulnerabilities are becoming impossible to ignore. The system that allowed the United States to run deficits, fund global military presence, and maintain economic leverage over the entire world is turning into a trap that makes all of those things harder, not easier. This is not about the dollar losing reserve currency status tomorrow. It is about the internal contradictions in the system reaching a point where the benefits of dollar dominance are exceeded by the costs of maintaining it. Let me walk you through exactly how this works, starting with what dollar dominance actually means. It means that international trade, particularly in critical commodities like oil, is denominated in dollars. When Saudi Arabia sells oil to China, the transaction happens in dollars. When Brazil buys machinery from Germany, the payment settles in dollars. When Vietnam exports electronics to the United States, the invoice is in dollars. This is not law. It is convention backed by infrastructure. The SWIFT payment system, the network of correspondent banks, the settlement mechanisms, all run primarily in dollars. This creates structural demand for dollars that exists independently of American economic fundamentals. Think about what that means. China needs dollars to buy oil, even though China and Saudi Arabia have their own currencies. That means China must earn dollars through exports or borrow them from international markets. Either way, China needs to maintain dollar reserves. The same logic applies to every country that participates in international trade. They need dollar reserves to facilitate transactions, even if those transactions do not involve the United States directly. This global demand for dollars allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits without the currency crisis that would destroy any other country attempting the same thing. Here is the mechanism. The United States imports more than it exports, creating a trade deficit that has averaged $500 billion annually for the past 2 decades. In a normal economic system, that deficit would weaken the currency as dollars flood foreign markets and lose value. But because the world needs dollars for international transactions, foreign governments and banks accumulate those dollars as reserves rather than selling them. They then use those dollars to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which finances American government borrowing. This recycling of dollars back into American debt allows the United States to borrow at lower interest rates than economic fundamentals would otherwise support. The result is a self-reinforcing system. Dollar dominance creates trade deficits. Trade deficits create dollar outflows. Dollar outflows create foreign dollar reserves. Foreign reserves create demand for treasury bonds. Treasury bond demand allows deficit spending. Deficit spending funds military presence. Military presence protects global trade. Protected trade happens in dollars. The loop closes. For 70 years, this system provided enormous advantages. The United States could borrow cheaply to fund consumption, investment, and military operations that maintained global order. Other countries accepted this arrangement because it provided stability, liquidity, and access to American markets and security guarantees. But the system has structural contradictions that are now becoming critical. The first contradiction is what economists call the Triffin dilemma, identified in 1960 but still operating today. For the dollar to serve as the global reserve currency, the United States must supply enough dollars to meet global demand. That requires running trade deficits so dollars flow out to the world. But persistent trade deficits mean the United States imports more than it exports, which weakens American manufacturing, creates domestic unemployment in traded sectors, and increases foreign claims on American assets. Eventually, the accumulation of foreign dollar claims becomes large enough that confidence in the dollar's value erodes. That erosion threatens the reserve currency status that made the deficit sustainable in the first place. We are now at the point where total U.S. federal debt exceeds $34 trillion. Foreign holders own roughly $6 trillion of that total. Japan holds $1 trillion. China holds about $870 billion despite reducing its holdings over the past decade. These are enormous claims on American future output, and they exist because the reserve currency system required the United States to run deficits large enough to supply the world with dollars. The system created its own destabilizing dynamic. The second contradiction is the weaponization paradox. Dollar dominance gives the United States enormous coercive power. Because international transactions clear through dollar-based systems, the United States can impose sanctions that cut targeted countries off from the global financial system. Iran, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea all have experienced American sanctions that freeze assets, prevent transactions, and cripple their ability to participate in international trade. This is tremendously powerful leverage, but every use of that leverage creates incentives for the rest of the world to build alternative systems that bypass dollar-based infrastructure. When the United States froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022, that was the most aggressive use of financial sanctions in modern history. The immediate effect was devastating for Russia. The long-term effect is that every country watching, particularly China, understood that holding reserves in dollars and transacting through dollar-based systems creates vulnerability to American policy decisions. That realization drives the development of alternative payment systems, bilateral currency swap agreements, and trade arrangements that deliberately avoid dollar exposure. China and Russia now settle significant portions of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. India buys Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China announce currency swap arrangements to facilitate direct trade without dollar intermediation. The BRICS countries are actively discussing mechanisms to reduce dollar dependency. None of these initiatives will replace the dollar in the near term, but collectively, they chip away at the structural demand for dollars that makes the reserve currency system work. The more aggressively the United States uses financial sanctions, the faster alternative systems develop. This is the weaponization paradox. The use of the weapon accelerates the process that will eventually make the weapon ineffective. The third contradiction is the domestic political backlash. Dollar dominance and the trade deficits it enables have created massive deindustrialization in American manufacturing regions. Factory closures, job losses, wage stagnation, community collapse, these are direct consequences of a trade policy that prioritizes global dollar liquidity over domestic industrial employment. The political reaction to this has been building for decades and exploded into mainstream politics over the past 10 years. Trade skepticism, industrial policy advocacy, calls for tariffs and reshoring, all of this represents the domestic political cost of maintaining the reserve currency system. The problem is that you cannot maintain dollar dominance while also running trade surpluses. The two goals are incompatible. If the United States restricted imports and increased exports to balance trade, fewer dollars would flow to the rest of the world. That would reduce global dollar liquidity, make it harder for other countries to hold dollar reserves, and weaken the structural demand that supports the dollar's reserve status. But if the United States continues running large trade deficits to supply global dollar demand, the domestic political backlash will continue intensifying. There is no equilibrium position that satisfies both the international need for dollar liquidity and the domestic need for industrial employment. Now think about how these contradictions compound under stress. Imagine a scenario where geopolitical tensions between the United States and China escalate significantly. The United States considers comprehensive economic sanctions on China similar to those imposed on Russia. But China is not Russia. China is the world's largest trading nation, deeply integrated into every global supply chain, holding over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. Sanctioning China would require cutting China off from dollar-based payment systems. That would be economically devastating for China, certainly. But it would also be devastating for the global trading system that depends on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese demand. What happens next? Countries that trade heavily with both the United States and China face an impossible choice. Comply with American sanctions and lose access to Chinese markets, or maintain trade with China and risk secondary sanctions from the United States. Many countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, would choose to maintain China trade because their economies depend on it. But they cannot do that while transacting in dollars if the United States has sanctioned dollar transactions with China. So they would be forced to develop alternative payment mechanisms. Currency swaps, barter arrangements, transactions in yuan or euros or gold, anything that allows trade to continue without dollar exposure. The immediate effect would be chaos as new systems get built on emergency timelines. The medium-term effect would be a dramatic acceleration of de-dollarization as these emergency systems become permanent infrastructure. The United States would have used its ultimate weapon, control of the dollar-based financial system, and in doing so would have destroyed the structural structural foundations that made that weapon powerful. Here is the historical analogy that makes the pattern clear. Britain maintained global dominance in the 19th and early 20th centuries through control of maritime trade routes, naval supremacy, and the gold standard centered on London. British power rested on a self-reinforcing system where control of sea lanes protected trade generated wealth that flowed through London banks, and financial centrality in London funded the navy that protected the sea lanes. The system worked brilliantly until the costs of maintaining it exceeded the benefits it provided. World War I was the breaking point. Britain spent enormous resources maintaining its position, borrowed heavily to finance the war, and emerged victorious but financially exhausted. The pound's role as the primary reserve currency became unsustainable because Britain could not simultaneously run the trade deficits necessary to supply global liquidity and maintain the domestic economic strength that made the pound credible. The gold standard collapsed, the pound's reserve status eroded, and financial dominance shifted to the United States, which had the economic strength to bear the costs that Britain could no longer sustain. The United States is now in a structurally similar position. Dollar dominance creates benefits, but also costs. The benefits are cheap borrowing, international leverage, and the ability to fund global military presence. The costs are deindustrialization, enormous debt accumulation, and vulnerability to the breakdown of the system if confidence erodes. For decades, the benefits exceeded the costs, but the costs are rising and the benefits are shrinking. The domestic political costs of deindustrialization are forcing changes in trade policy that reduce dollar outflows. The geopolitical costs of using financial sanctions as a primary tool are accelerating alternative system development. The fiscal costs of funding global military presence while managing massive debt are becoming unsustainable as interest payments on federal debt consume an increasing share of the budget. At some point, maintaining the system costs more than the system provides. And here is where the trap closes. The United States cannot simply choose to abandon dollar dominance because doing so deliberately would trigger immediate crisis. If the U.S. government announced it would no longer maintain the dollar as the global reserve currency, international confidence would collapse overnight. Dollar assets would be dumped, treasury bonds would be sold, and the financial chaos would be catastrophic. So the United States is locked into maintaining a system that is becoming increasingly costly and increasingly vulnerable. But the United States also cannot prevent the slow erosion of dollar dominance as other countries diversify their reserves, develop alternative payment systems, and reduce dollar exposure. Each of those actions individually is small. Collectively, they reduce the structural demand for dollars that makes the reserve currency system work. The United States can slow this process but not stop it because the incentives driving other countries to reduce dollar dependency are structural, not temporary. Think about what this means over the next 20 years. Not a sudden collapse where the dollar loses reserve status in a crisis. That is possible, but not the most likely scenario. More likely is gradual, persistent erosion. The share of global foreign exchange reserves held in dollars declines from 60% to 50% to 40%. The share of international trade settled in dollars declines similarly. Alternative payment systems handle increasing percentages of transactions. China, Europe, India, and regional blocs develop financial infrastructure that operates independently of dollar-based systems. Each percentage point decline in dollar dominance means the United States must pay slightly higher interest rates to borrow, must rely slightly less on financial sanctions as a tool of coercion, must accept slightly less leverage over global economic policy. None of these changes is dramatic in any single year, but compounded over 2 decades, they transform the structure of American power. The ability to borrow cheaply to fund military operations declines. The ability to sanction adversaries without alternative systems existing declines. The ability to run trade deficits without currency crisis declines. And as those capabilities decline, the United States faces impossible choices. Reduce global military commitments to match reduced borrowing capacity, which allows rivals to expand influence. Or maintain military commitments while debt costs escalate, which creates fiscal crisis. or attempt to reverse the erosion of dollar dominance through aggressive actions that accelerate the very process they are trying to prevent. There is no good option because the trap is structural. The system that created American dominance contained the seeds of its own erosion, and we are now in the phase where the erosion is visible, measurable, and accelerating despite American efforts to prevent it. The dollar's dominance was never a permanent feature of the global system. It was a historical contingency that served specific purposes for a specific period. And that period is ending not because America chooses to end it, but because the internal contradictions of the system make continuation unsustainable. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not American strength through dollar dominance. What you see is American vulnerability masked by the fading benefits of a system that is breaking down. The next financial crisis, the next sanctions regime, the next geopolitical confrontation, each of these has the potential to accelerate the process in ways that cannot be reversed. The trap is not that the dollar will collapse tomorrow. The trap is that every action taken to preserve dollar dominance creates the conditions for its erosion. And the United States has no way out that does not involve accepting a significant reduction in global power and influence. That reckoning is coming. The only question is whether it arrives gradually or suddenly, managed or chaotic. But it is coming because the system that created American dominance for 80 years has turned into the mechanism of its decline.